Welcome guys, so we're going to talk a little bit about social action theory and postmodernism as the last two theories to address as part of the Unit 10 Sociological Perspectives topic for BTEC Health and Sociological Level 3. So we're just going to briefly talk about these two theories. As always, work through the pack, work through the materials that you would have been sent by your teachers, and hopefully I'll provide a little bit of an explanation of how these theories approach healthcare. So let's start with social action theory. So as you can see just by those big two definitions at the bottom, it's a micro approach and it's a social action approach. It's very different to what we've done so far. So if you think about the other theories we've reviewed at this point so far, we've looked at functionalism, we've looked at Marxism, and we've looked at feminism. All of these theories have been macro and structural. They've also been, in the case of Marxism, feminism, conflict, and functionalism was consensus. Now, social action theory, where we are today, is very different because it's a micro approach. It's looking at the small scale. It's also an action theory, focusing on interactions between groups of people. So, as I always kind of sort of anecdotally say about the name of this, that it should be social excuse the awful writing, but it should almost be considered social interaction theory. So it's looking at how people interact with one another. So it is a macro and it's a social action theory. It's not conflict, it's not consensus, so it doesn't fit in that way. The only similarity we can pull so far, if we put in that compare and contrast, is it is a modern theory, because it did happen in the late sort of 60s and 70s, so it's a modern approach. So that's where we are with social action theory. Now, if we're kind of thinking about it on a grander scale, social action theory, as we said, is micro, it's small scale. So at this point, it is really focusing on the individual, whereas a macro theory is looking at the whole of this society. It's looking at everything going on up here. So that's a macro approach. The micro approach is looking at the individual, and what it might look at is the interactions we have with other people. It might look at how we're involved with institutions such as healthcare, in the family, in sort of society, in employment, but it's basically looking at a very small scale level. It's looking at individual interactions and the meanings, the feelings, the experiences of them. Whereas the macro approaches, the big scale pictures up here, this is really looking at the big whole picture. It's not looking about individual feelings, motivations, experience. It's all about generally what is happening in society. Now, if you think about the views of interactions, so these are the answers to some questions in your pack. So what type of group might an interactionist study? That would be teenage gangs, it could be patients, or it could be staff and visitors in a hospital. It could be looking at a classroom. It could be looking at a GP practice. It could be looking at a support group, a social well-being group for an individual. Basically, any situation where you have individuals interacting, an interactionist would be interested in studying. So as I said, that key point here, interaction, is effectively in their name. Now, what type of question would they be looking at? So interactionists might think about, how does an individual see themselves in a group? Why do some people have more power than others in a group? What does someone feel by being part of the group? How do they interact with other people? What do they think about other people? So it's all a lot about feelings, thoughts, and emotional connections. The difference from structuralism, as we highlighted earlier, is the scale. So structuralist is macro scale, interactionism is micro. Interaction is all about interactions, how we understand the world around us, our thoughts, our feelings, our motivation. Structural theories see us as pre-programmed. We don't have autonomy, we don't have freedom. We do as we're told, we are shaped by society. So there's a slight difference in how they view how we fit into the world. And thinking about the notion of motherhood, which has come up in feminism and is obviously key within our local settings, they would sort of talk about social action theory, would look at the idea that there's no clear definition of what it means to be a mother, what motherhood means. Every individual would shape it in their own context, own meaning. And for sociology and sociologists, the role is to try and find out what those roles are and how people define being a mother. Now, general criticisms of interactionism, if we think about the criticism, structural approaches are going to provide quite a strong criticism, because they say that micro theories, because they're focusing on the individual, they ignore the wider structural forces at play. So, for example, you might look at someone from and look at their health issues and look at their experience and how they interact with other people, but Marxists might say, well, you're ignoring their social class, you're ignoring the influence of capitalism and wealth inequality. Feminism might say you're ignoring gender inequality. So there are some general criticisms, the same way that we would criticize structural theories for ignoring the individual experience. Social action theory focuses on the individual and ignores the wider structural. So that's the kind of the key issue between them. And what they also look at is, as I said, when you're having an interaction with a healthcare professional like a doctor, they might ignore the wider influences on that interaction. Now, when it comes to linking it to healthcare, applications to healthcare, so interactionists emphasize, the classification, the sick role. Sick role comes up a lot. Parsons and functionalism, Marxism talks about it, and social action also discuss it. So there is a bit of overlap between these theories. They're all discussing a similar process or thought. So the idea being that doctors will have a discussion with the patient, they will think about their illness, they will talk about their illness, doctors will make a decision about whether the patient is actually ill. And really it's the interaction between the doctor and the patient that determines the decision the doctor makes. So it's looking at the interaction between the two, that's been key here. That also then filters into labelling theory. So if a person is labelled as sick, there can be consequences. So this is almost looking at, once you have an illness, once you have a condition, there is what we call stigma, which is negative connotations, negative attitudes, negative thoughts, and that can be what comes under this idea of labelling. You can label someone and attach stigma to them because of an illness. So a good example might be HIV or mental illness. These are both health conditions which come with a lot of stigma and negative labelling. And again, if you label someone negatively because they have HIV, because they have mental health, that can have an impact on that individual. So again, the consequences of the stigma might mean that someone, their health deteriorates because of other things like stress and negative self-image. Learned helplessness could also be key things that also develop here. Linking social action theory to your setting, as we said, doctors control the sick role. They decide whether you are sick. So your interaction with the GP will be key for determining your health and your treatment. And that's obviously one thing. Obviously, I realise I've left the disruption to capitalism, which isn't really social actionism. That's poor editing on my part. That's Marxism. So I'm just going to delete that, so that's gone. Now, the other sort of applications we have is increased focus on the patient and the holistic care. So focusing on the whole person. So again, it's more about the idea that the doctor will talk to that person, they'll explore their health. So there is a little bit more focus on individualized care, meeting the needs of the individual. And also one of the things, because it is all about interactions, think about who you interact with when you want to go to your GP. So think about, you call the receptionist, that's an interaction. You might interact with a nurse, you interact with a doctor. These are all interactions taking place in your settings, and you will form a meaning. So whether you don't like having to talk to the receptionist because you think they're rude or they're kind of being nosy, whether you don't like talking to the doctor because you had a bad experience once, you might prefer to talk to the nurse because they're more friendly and welcoming. So it's the idea that your interaction, your experience will shape your meaning of healthcare and visiting healthcare settings. Strengths of the theory, just again thinking about sort of what's good about it. There is a focus on individualized care. It's client-centered. It's focusing on the individual. It does ignore the wider causes of illness. So it is kind of focusing on the individual. We have links to holistic care. So the idea of full well-being, so physical, intellectual, emotional, social well-being. And it sees the individuals or the humans or the people as active. So we are autonomous. We are in control. We have a key role to play in our health. We're not passive victims of the structure of society. Whereas quite structural theorists tend to think we are shaped by society and we're passive victims of it. Weaknesses of the theory, as we said earlier at the very beginning, is criticised by structural theories. It ignores the influence of class, capitalism, money, gender, patriarchy as ways of affecting our health. And again, it's because it is too small scale, it doesn't look at the wider causes that affect interactions between a patient. We talked about stigma attached to an illness. It doesn't look at the wider causes of the stigma that might be associated with HIV or with mental health. And then that leads us into postmodernism. Now again, postmodernism is an odd theory. It emerged in the 1980s. So thinking about our timeline at the bottom here, we're looking at postmodernism. As I said in the very first video, most of the theories we covered, I'm just going to draw this line here, are modern theories. They existed or they studied society from the 1900s to the 1980s, but all of them studied this same version of society. They just looked at it from a different point of view, a different perspective. Postmodernism sets itself aside. It is looking at society today, so it's the theory we can generally associate as being slightly more contemporary, slightly more modern, slightly more applicable today. It recognises change and it tries to explain healthcare today. So from the 1980s onwards. Now again, saying it is talking about the day, I realised the 1980s is a long time ago, and what healthcare was like in the 80s is very different to healthcare now. So even that could even be a flaw in postmodernism, that even by stating it is more contemporary, it's still kind of, some of its ideas are still outdated. Now, what's also different about this theory is it's not macro, it's not micro, it's not structural, it's not action, it's not conflict or consensus. It doesn't fit any of those modern categories of organising theory. It's a postmodern approach, and as I said, it's studying society in a period of time, which is the 1980s onwards, so this period of time here, as opposed to the modern theories, which is studying the same version of society but from a different perspective. So it doesn't fit any formal categories of macro, micro structure. It's studying society in the postmodern era, and that's what sets it aside from the rest. So it's a slightly odd approach, but it doesn't really fit any categorization or ways of explaining it. Now, postmodernism, it is, as I say, it's very different. It's all about the valid knowledge. It's about trying to bring in contemporary understanding. It looks at theories like Marxism, functionalism, feminism, and it talks about, they use this word meta-narrative. So they are big picture, they are big explanations, they're big stories, and they're one way of explaining the world. And what postmodernism says is that none of these stories are definitive truth. So Marxism, which claims to understand the world, it understands one version of the world. So postmodernism says that we live in a time of change, of chaos, of lots of different theories, lots of different explanations, and ultimately there is no such typical explanation. So when it comes to family life, for example, there's no single set type of family. There is this diversity to choose from, and the same applies to healthcare. There's a lot of consumer goods and healthcare choices that we can make that shape our health and our well-being. Now, to criticise postmodernism, as I mentioned before, it rejects those big theories, Marxism, feminism, functionalism, as it tries to explain society, it tries to shape behaviour, but it's only one explanation. And postmodernists reject that. So it does ignore the wider structural causes and influences on our lives. We also talk about this idea of choice. Now, postmodernists recognise that choice is key. We have choice, we have diversity, we have flexibility. But one of the things that it doesn't recognise, or could be considered as not considering, is that we don't all have free choice. We don't all have the flexibility that is being suggested. You can't just go to Australia tomorrow and live out there for 4 months and do what you want. If you think you have to think about your job, your family, your friends, how would you pay for it? You'd have to get visas. So you don't have the flexibility and choice that they suggest we have. Now, if we apply this to our healthcare setting, one of the things we've got here is the rejection of those single models. I mentioned postmodernism doesn't try to narrowly explain or define society. It looks at the idea that there's all these different explanations, all these different versions, accounts, truths, feelings, and it tries to kind of accommodate all of them as the fact we have choice and we can do what we want. So one of the things we're going to talk about later in the course, we talk about this biomedical approach, which is something we're going to study as part of P3, which is the next topic after this unit. Now, biomedical approach is an idea that doctors focus on healthcare. So we, basically giving you medicine to treat a condition. And in society, that's become the common approach. So if you don't feel well, you take medicine, you take a drug, you go to a doctor. And what postmodernism says is that there are lots of different alternative or complementary treatments. So it's looking at sort of acupuncture, aromatherapies, it's looking at alternative ways of healing, like crystal healing, faith healing. There's all these different approaches that we could take, and we are narrowly directed towards the biomedical generally by the way society views illness. So that's one criticism of it, or one way we could link it. So when you're thinking about your setting, does your setting offer any alternative forms of treatment or care? Now, the growing consumer culture in health, postmodernism is interested in the way the human body has become the focus of consumer-led society. So the idea that we form our identity based on consumer choices, by what we buy, what we wear, what things like cosmetic surgery, tattoos, body piercings. And again, that could be one thing to think about with your GP, is that do they offer any elective treatments or any support for elective treatments? It could be stuff like going through gender changes. So again, the idea about anything about how we shape ourselves, does your GP link to that? So just a few things. Again, development of medical procedures by choice, family diversity, gender identity, trans communities, all growing, and these can be ways where your GP links to that diversity. Lots of people, different health needs, different beliefs, different values, different systems coming into your GP. So again, one of the things you could look at is, what does your GP do or your setting do to accommodate the diversity of people that might be coming into your setting? You could look at the growth of technology. So again, that's one really big thing here about the growth of technology and how your services might be offered online. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, think about like holistic treatments, complementary medicine. Does your GP stick to, you take this pill, you take this medicine, you have this injection, or do they branch out and say, why don't you do some aromatherapy or acupuncture or yoga or meditation? Do they branch out and offer alternatives to taking a drug or taking a medicine? So, strengths of the theory and how it applies to health. So we have greater control over aspects of our body, what we buy, what we do with our body. So think about piercings, tattooing, cosmetic surgeries, gym memberships. All of this forms part of our identity, and we are shaping our identity more with our body. And again, so doctors may involve or be experiencing stuff like cosmetic treatments, or the repercussions of people who have got, had like piercings and stretches, and then their earlobe extends and they have to go then to have sort of the excess skin removed and have it re-sewed up. So doctors will have to experience the fallout and the effects of self-identity creation. More availability, more acceptance and affordability to increase the use of cosmetic procedures. There's more choice for patients on how they can be treated. The theory does reflect a more contemporary version of the healthcare system. All the modern theories, they're pre-1980s, quite old-fashioned views of healthcare, so it is slightly more updated. And most patients will feel better informed about healthcare because of the information they receive, and obviously making choice in their treatments. So it does kind of link back to the idea of empowerment. The flaws, however, as we mentioned right at the beginning, it rejects the big theory. It's criticised for ignoring that we are constrained by class and money and gender. And then just some examples of news articles. So again, these specifically linked to technology entering healthcare. So The West Midlands have been using 5G test beds, which are connected to ambulances as part of treatment. So you've got the link, and Alexa has also been linked to provide NHS support for patients. So again, the idea of growing technology and its use in healthcare. And there we have it. So that's social action theory and postmodernism summed up nicely there. Thanks for watching.